So on this rare book episode, let me say that more dramatically. On this rare book episode, I would like to discuss the topic of book conservation and repair. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to address this is, of course, because I get so many questions. Should I repair this book? How much money should I spend repairing it? And if I repair it, will it damage the value of the book? And certainly you do not want to be one of those people who drag on their antique Chippendale chair onto the Antique Roadshow, only to hear the appraiser tell you, well, it's a fine chair, would be worth $25,000, except that you've stripped it of its patina and you have painted it frog green. So it's only worth 25, or maybe 50 to a frog. So repairing books should take a lot of thought and consideration, and of course you're always welcome to reach out to me with pictures for an opinion. Now I'm going to show you several examples of books that I currently have which are desperately in need of repair. And I'm going to try and approach this from, I would say, an aesthetic point of view, how I go about it, historical preservationist point of view, as well as a commercial point of view, because of course I am a bookseller, and one of the things we booksellers love is to make a profit, and certainly one of the sources of making a profit in the rare book trade is to find important rare volumes, perhaps not in their most presentable shape, put some money into the works, and then sell them on at a higher price. Now, before I show you the books I have on the table here, I would just say what is my general overall approach to book repair. And that is the old bookbinder's oath, which unfortunately Hippocrates or a doctor stole, and that is do no harm. And I think that's very important, at least for me, because I really love and am passionate about the ravages of time, the book's journey through history, and the wear and tear on the volume often reflects that. So I like to preserve the book as much as possible and not do repairs that look artificial or make it new, which some people unfortunately do. Now, another thing to think about is when you go about book repair is to make sure, regardless of what repairs you do not throw out the paste downs or the end papers or the blanks, especially if they contain any evidence of ownership or provenance, because that's certainly very important to preserve for collectors, historians, future historians. And many times you come across books rebound in the 19th and 20th century, and the binder has callously tossed out all previous evidence of book ownership and just replaced it with later paper, which is often extremely disappointing and frustrating, as you can imagine. So let's look at 3 books. Now, the first book I'll start with here, as you can see, the covers are flying off, and that is The History of Don Quixote, published in London in 1652. So this is an early translation of Don Quixote into English. Now, they say Don Quixote is, of course, to the Spanish what Shakespeare is to the English, but clearly the English really immediately recognize Don Quixote as a very important and influential work, and were eager to have it translated. And Thomas Shelton took up the job of translating it for the first time into English, I think the first time into any language. And he published the first part in 1612 and the second part in 1620. Both of those are extremely valuable books. This 1652 edition, as far as I know, is the first time that both parts were published together. Now, Thomas Shelton's translation was criticized sometimes for its very literal translation of the Spanish into English, but nevertheless it was extremely influential. One of the charming things I like here is in the preface. Shelton writes that he translated this out of the Spanish tongue into the English in the space of 40 days, so quite a short time for translating one of the most important works of Spanish literature into English. But then again, Moses took 40 years wandering in the desert, and the Promised Land was right there, so can't fault him too much. Now, before I begin thinking about book repair, one of the first things I think about is what is the value of the book? Is it worth repairing, monetarily at least, I should say. Now, if this book was in very good condition in a contemporary binding, a binding of the 17th century, maybe a $5,000 or $6,000 book, in its current state, it's probably worth only a couple $1,000s. So certainly that gives you breathing room of $3,000 or $4,000 to play with. And even if you can only go halfway and raise the price a couple $1,000s, certainly that is worth putting $500 or $700 into the proper repair and restoration of the volume. Another thing to consider before you go about repairing a book is the text block itself. Is it complete? Is it damaged in some way? Does it have any stains or imperfections? Because obviously you don't want to put a lot of money into a book that is incomplete or severely damaged internally, because you will never see that money again, unless it's, for sentimental or preservationist reasons perhaps, but certainly not from a commercial standpoint. Luckily, the text block of this volume is complete and in pretty good condition. The only fault it has, I think, is it's got some light browning throughout. That's often the case for this particular edition. It was printed on some rather poor quality paper. So how would I go about repairing this volume? Now, as I said, this is not in its original binding from the 17th century. So I couldn't fault you if you really just wanted to cast these old boards aside and had it restored in the style of a 17th century binding. That would probably cost, however, a lot of money. A good sympathetic binding to the period can be $1,500. Now, that is not an approach I would take from a historical preservationist direction, and also from a commercial direction, because it would just cost too much money to recoup. I would just like to have the boards repaired here. That would be the simplest and the cheapest approach. But with that said, I also like the binding as it is. This is a 19th century 3/4 Morocco binding with marbled paper over some boards here, and I happen to find marbled paper very charming. And as I said, it's part of the book's journey through history. Some collector in the late 19th century had it bound like this. Now, who is the collector? Unfortunately, we have no book plate. We have no evidence of ownership on any of the blanks. As I said, this is a perfect example of where they've been cast aside by an old binder and replaced by some rather horrid, even acidic paper here. I would probably have the bookbinder take out this paper and replace it with something more sympathetic to the period. I probably have in that closet over there some blank 17th century paper he could work with. Another reason for keeping the binding is, even though I don't have evidence of ownership on the blanks or with the book plate, there are some interesting, there's an interesting binding tool here which looks like an eagle and a wreath. It's probably American. Now, I do not know who the collector is, but somebody perhaps with more specialized knowledge in binding tools or American collections of the 19th century may recognize that, or they may recognize it in the future. So a tiny little clue like that, I think, is certainly worth preserving. So that should be a relatively simple repair to reattach the boards, to probably color the worn corners and spine here and polish it up a little bit and make it very presentable. This is probably not a book that will find an institutional home because it's not rare institutionally already, but certainly it is a book with a lot of interest for collectors because it is such an important work in Spanish literature. So I want to make it as presentable as possible. So that is Don Quixote there. The second work here is a very interesting work. This is The Rights of Man to Property by Thomas Skidmore. It's published by the author in New York in 1829. Now, this is one of the earliest works of American radicalism with the labor movement here. Communism to make it all equal among the adults. And it is a very rare work. One of the reasons it's so rare is you do see a lot of reform movements, but many movements like the temperance movement or the abolitionist movement, these were often well-funded organizations that could print a lot of books. But when it comes to early labor reform, These were often solitary crusaders, and they often published them themselves in very small quantities. So this is a rare surviving book. Now, this is exactly how you want to find a book of the period. This is in its original early 19th century binding here. These are often scuffed and worn, and I wouldn't polish them up at all because just that's how books looked in the period. And luckily it retains its original spine label. This book actually has a remarkable innovation that changes it not just from a work of early American radical thought, but to a book that's important in the history of American bookbinding. And that is stamped to the title here in bright gold is "The Rights of Man to Property" with an exclamation mark. Now that's something that immediately caused me to be curious because I haven't seen that on such an early book before. And sure enough, in the advertisement at the back, they talk about this innovation in bookbinding of stamping on two covers in letters of gold the title of the work. And this is actually, believe it or not, the first time that a title was printed on the covers for all the known copies of the work. Now you do have manuscript titles on books by bookbinders individually, but never because of a decision by the publisher or the author to print it on all copies. You see this much more in the 1840s and 1850s when it certainly became commonplace. But this is 1829, so a very interesting work from the history of bookbinding. Now, because it is such an important book and it retains its original binding, I do want to be very careful with the repair, and the board also needs reattachment here. There's also an old glue repair. Now, many times you can have a board reattached for $90, $100 by a reasonably competent bookbinder. These often look rather clumsy, but to do a really good board attachment for a book like this can sometimes cost $500 or so from a very experienced bookbinder. And I would want to put the money into that because, again, it is such a rare book in its original binding here. And after that, I would certainly place it in an appropriate case to highlight the significance of the volume and preserve it for the future. So that is The Rights of Man to Property. And finally, we will bring on, last but not least, this incredibly decrepit and falling volume here, but it is a wonderful Bible. This is the 1549 Matthew's Bible in English. John Rogers was an English clergyman of the period, and he translated the Bible first in 1537. So this is the second edition in 1549. It's called the Matthew's Bible because he assumed the pseudonym Thomas Matthew when he translated, obviously because of potential religious persecution in the period. This also has a horrid name associated just with this edition. It's called the Wife Beater's Bible. That's because of a footnote that was placed in Peter. I think it's like Peter 3:7, something to the effect of hitting your wife over the head to beat the gospel into her. Believe it or not. I mentioned that on Instagram, by the way, and everybody jumped on me with comments about being anti-Catholic and misogynist. Certainly, I only mean that from a historical point of view. That just happens to be the name for this rather odd edition of the Bible. Besides that curious fact, and it being an important English translation, this Bible has some rather remarkable provenance. It's got here in a late 16th century, early 17th century hand an inscription from the Advocates' Library of Scotland. Now, the Advocates' Library was one of the most important law libraries in the British Isles. Eventually, it was absorbed into the National Library of Scotland. I don't know how this book got out, or maybe it was just present at the beginning when it was being formed, and because it wasn't it was a religious rather than a legal text, it was didn't make the final catalog, but certainly provenance worth studying. But even more importantly is a signature at the back here of Alexander Livingstone and some notes in the book. And he was Alexander Livingstone, the fifth Lord Livingstone, who not only commanded the Scottish forces against the English, but he was the guardian of Mary, Queen of Scots herself. So I'm holding in my hand the Bible of the guardian and probably tutor of Mary, Queen of Scots. So that to me is really remarkable, makes this book quite important and special. Someone in the 19th century here has made special note of that. They actually drew up a whole genealogical chart showing the original owner of the book here as Alexander V, Lord Livingstone, and how the book was inherited all the way down to the 1940s. So I really find that to be quite remarkable that we can trace the book through the centuries. Now, this is a book I want to put considerable money in, not money that I will necessarily recoup, unfortunately, which goes against my commercial instincts, but it's in keeping with my historical preservationist instincts and love of the book itself, and also because the family that sold me this entrusted me that I would do appropriate repairs on it and place it in a good institution like the Library of Scotland. So if you're watching, I have not contacted you yet, but I probably will soon. So I want to do my best to honor that commitment. So how would I go about? Now this really needs some work. Immediately this needs some stabilization. The text block is a little bit weak, and for proper handling, some of it actually might have to be resewn. That is very expensive and often requires a really superb bookbinder to be able to do that. In terms of the leather itself, now you can repair the leather in two ways. You can find sympathetic leather to the period and sometimes even make it look imperceptible, the binding where it's been repaired. Certainly that is the more aesthetic approach, I would say. It's not necessarily the approach I would take in this particular instance. I like to take what I call the archaeological approach. And that is, if you've ever seen in a museum, let's say a vase from ancient Greece that's been dug up in shards, and when they put it back together, you can easily differentiate the modern plaster from the ancient shard, so you can see the whole vase in a presentable form, but it's very easy to see where and how it's been repaired. And I actually like that approach in this case. I'd probably pick a leather that was very obvious that it was not the original leather, so people could see where it has indeed been repaired and what is original. But again, it would stabilize the book and allow it to be preserved and handled properly. And after that, again, I would place it in a custom box, to highlight the book's importance. So I would love in a future episode to show you how these books turned out. So I will certainly do that. If I do not, send me emails, comments, complain to me vociferously, because sometimes I can forget what I recorded 6 months ago and promised to do. So thank you so much for watching, and if you have any questions about a book you're considering repairing, especially if it's an important book, you're welcome to reach out to me. I can give you my best advice. I can sometimes point you to a book restorer, a book binder that could also give you additional advice in your area. So thank you again for watching, and make sure you subscribe as well, because that certainly helps my channel. So thank you again.